Today I'm going to be following up on some previous videos that I've done on my truck here to answer some of the most common questions that I've gotten since doing the build video on the truck and also the air suspension payload demo video. Now I'm going to split up this Q&A video into two parts so that it's not so long. But if you haven't seen the original build video on the truck that I did and also the air suspension, the payload demo, definitely check those out as it'll give some context into today's video. I'll put a card up above and links in the description below for those. Now these questions and points I'm going to discuss today are really some of the most common ones that I've gotten, and of course they're generated through the comment section on YouTube, but I've got them all on my phone here. And so the first one is, what kind of MPGs do I get on the Ram 3500 dually? Of course, it's with the high output Cummins and the 4:10 axle ratio. And so for me, typically 16 miles per gallon seems to be about my average, when I'm using it as a daily driver, unladen, of course, not towing anything. And that's not really city driving or highway driving, but really a blend, a mixture of that. I'm probably traveling an average speed of 40 to 50 miles per hour, minimal stops and starts. And so really that 16 miles per gallon seems to be about the average for myself at least. Now, when I'm towing with the Pinnacle back here, that weighs about 17,000 pounds, typically I'm going to get about 9 to 10 miles per gallon. So pretty average, I think, for most folks towing. I usually keep the speed at about 65 miles per hour or under, just kind of depending on what the speed limit is. Pretty rare for me to go over 65 miles per hour when I'm towing. And so yeah, that 9 to 10 miles per gallon is pretty average. I think if you go a little bit faster, 70 or over 70, your MPGs are going to go down a pretty good bit there. Now, as far as highway empty, it's pretty rare for me to take the truck, unladen without any load on it whatsoever on the highway for a longer trip. In fact, in the last 12,000 miles, I think I only did that one time, maybe really a longer trip, and that was when I was picking up actually the Pinnacle and driving out of state to get there. It was about a 7-hour trip or so, and if I recall, I was driving probably in the 70 to 75 mile per hour range on the highways, and I think I got close to 19 or so on the truck. That was when the truck had about probably 7,000 or 8,000 miles on it, and so it wasn't broken in quite as well as now. So maybe you could get up to 20 miles per gallon, maybe a little bit over 20 miles per gallon. But for me, I think the best I've ever gotten was about 19 or so on the highway empty. Now, if you're watching this and you own a similar truck or even a different brand, I'd love to hear how those MPG figures compare with what you're getting in the real world. So definitely drop us a note in the comments below, and be sure to give some context, and talk about what kind of truck you have, the axle ratio, what kind of engine, dually, single rear wheel, and so forth. All right, let's touch on another topic, and that is the Uconnect 12.0 versus the Uconnect 8.4. So if you saw my build video, you know that I chose the 8.4 inch screen primarily because I'm using Android Auto for the most part, and it would have just stacked that Android Auto on top of a second card below. And in my opinion, that's kind of wasteful not to be able to maximize that full 12-inch screen and have the Android Auto, fill in that whole screen. And so I just opted for the 8.4 inch screen instead, and that way I still get some nice buttons and knobs below the screen there. Now, several of you pointed out that with the latest Uconnect 5 version, and that's in the 2022s, it's my understanding, you can have full screen Apple CarPlay in those 2022s with the latest Uconnect 5 in the 12-inch screen in that portrait mode. And so that's super helpful to know. Thank you everyone who pointed that out and corrected me. Now, for some reason, it's my understanding that with Android Auto, you still cannot maximize it to the full 12-inch screen. So it's still only going to fill half of the screen, even on the latest Uconnect on the 2022s, the version 5. And that certainly can change. So if you're watching this and you've got more experience on it, definitely let us know in the comments below. But for me personally, I still like my 8.4 inch screen, having all the physical buttons below. But I will say the Uconnect version 5.0 on the 2022 models, it definitely looks like a nice upgrade visually and feature-wise. So, maybe if I was an Apple user, I'd go for the newer 12-inch screen. But I think for now, being an Android user, I'm going to keep my 8.4 inch screen, even if I could do it all over again. All right, next question is going to be on the tires. And I've gotten a lot of comments and questions on the tires, such as why did I put cheap, as many of them have called them, cheap tires, cheap Nexen tires on my $80,000 build? Well, for dualies, Ram only offers the Nexen tires. They offer a highway tire option and then an all-terrain tire option. That's the one that I chose. And it is what it is. You know, it seems like it's been that way for several years. They don't advertise the brand of tires on their build when you go on the site and configure it. So that naturally could change based on supply. But as far as I know, they've been pretty much exclusive with the Nexen Tires really for quite some time now on the dualies. And, you know, I don't think I ever heard of Nexen Tires before seeing them on the Ram dualies. So yeah, it'd be kind of nice if they supplied a more well-known OEM tire, maybe a Michelin, you know, or a Bridgestone. But for a reason unknown to me, Ram has stuck with these Nexen tires for a while now. And you know, the Nexen tires, they ride fine for me. There's no complaints on my end. But I will say after 12,000 miles on the truck, I can see some really faint, small cracking on the front tires, kind of in between the treads. They're starting to wear down on the front a good bit from all the turning that I do here, getting in and out of the driveway. So I'll probably have to replace them in the next 6 months or so. I don't think they're going to go beyond 15 or 20,000 miles. But definitely let me know in the comments below if you've already replaced tires on your truck similar to mine. Definitely let me know if you have any recommendations. I'm probably looking for a similar tread pattern, you know, something that's a little more aggressive than a highway tire. So definitely let me know if you've got any recommendations for that in the comments below. Now let's talk about the suspension, specifically the air suspension. And most of these questions and points are really generated out of the demo that I did on the air suspension with the Payload. And so the first question is, does the air suspension provide a superior ride unloaded and loaded compared to, of course, traditional leaf springs? And really this goes whether it's a Ram or another brand. And my thoughts on that are, you know, probably. I haven't driven a Ram truck back-to-back, one with air suspension and one without. But, you know, logically, the leaf springs, they're fairly rigid, right? They're designed to support the load and not squat, right? And so it makes sense that if you have fewer leaf springs, then the ride could be, you know, a little bit smoother. But really, I'd just like to say that with modern trucks, this is my opinion, but with modern trucks, they all really have great suspension nowadays. And so that while I would suggest, yeah, the air suspension probably does ride smoother overall, I don't think it's going to be a drastic night and day difference where the air suspension is just vastly superior. That's just my subjective opinion, of course. So yes, I think it does make a difference overall, but really the other selling points, really the big ones in my opinion, are that you can somewhat adjust the ride height with different payloads to potentially level out your trailer. You know, that's a huge benefit that you can't do with just leaf packs alone. And then the other big selling point is the ability to completely dump the airbags when you're moving really slowly or to stand still. So really those benefits combined with the ride quality are the big selling points that I think make the air suspension worthwhile. And then another question, or really a point of clarification, is when I talked about the air suspension in the build video and then showed what the leaf packs looked like in the demo video on the air suspension, the question is the suspension different on Ram trucks between ones that have the airbags versus the trucks that have no airbags and only the leaf springs? And the answer is yes, it is indeed different between trucks that have air suspension and trucks that don't have air suspension. You know, when I recorded that video, I thought they might be different, but I hadn't seen one up in person for a while, and so I couldn't recall how they were different specifically. So thank you to everyone that corrected me and chimed in the comments below. So basically the air suspension model, like mine, it has 4 leaf springs in the back, whereas the regular version without the air suspension and just the leaf springs, it's going to have a pack of 6. So it indeed is different. Of course, that makes sense. You know, the air suspension is there not just to level the load, but arguably to make it more comfortable, especially when it's unladen. Now, I also had folks comment who own the same truck as mine without the air suspension, and they said basically they do not have issues with squat, even without the air suspension. Now, I haven't tested that myself, obviously. I'm just going off what others have commented. But the point I'm trying to make is if you're on the fence as to whether to get the air suspension or not, and squat is your main concern alone, well, folks have commented that squat is just not an issue on the 3500 dualies without air suspension. So really it's more about the comfort and the ride quality. You know, I think those are the selling points in the end. So is it a must-have? I mean, is the air suspension something you absolutely need to add to your build? Not necessarily. I think it's nice to have for sure. I think if I'd still order it again, for me personally, I would do it. But certainly let me know what you think in the comments below. All right, now some folks commented on my build and called out the Aisin transmission, describing it as just driving horribly, unladen, and having really bad manners, being just unbearable. Those were some of the different comments people shared. So let me just touch on that real briefly. I've owned the Ram 3/4 ton, you know, the 2500 with the 68 RFE, the 6-speed. I've also owned the Chevy Duramax, a dually, with the Aisin transmission, the older 6-speed version. And yeah, sure, I'd say that the 68 RFE was probably the smoothest out of all of them, unladen. But listen, I would never say that the Aisin, or even the Aisin for that matter, that was in my Chevy, was just a horrible daily driver. And again, that's just my subjective opinion. I mean, I'm used to the Aisin. I drive it almost daily. You know, once in a while, it may have a rougher shift going from first to second at a slower speed. But folks, in my opinion, especially when it's up to speed, I don't have any complaints on the Aisin. You know, maybe I'm just not picky, but I've never thought to myself, man, this Aisin, it's just horrible. And that goes for whether I'm towing or I'm empty. You know, in my opinion, it's a great heavy-duty transmission. And I think the benefits outweigh any cons. You know, the benefit of having the higher output with more horsepower, more torque. You know, it's nothing to shy away from. I mean, maybe if you're looking at a short bed 1-ton single rear wheel truck, maybe then the 68 RFE makes more sense for you. But I just wanted to clarify with all the negative comments that folks have alleged on the Aisin transmission, you know, behaving so poorly and roughly unladen. I just don't find that to be true personally. But again, it's just my subjective opinion, and maybe I'm just used to it. Well, folks, that's all I'm going to discuss in this first part of the Q&A on my truck. Stay tuned next week for the second part, in which I'll discuss in more depth, more extensively, about the recommendations that I made for choosing a truck. You know, whether half-ton, 3/4 ton, 1-ton, gas or diesel, dually or single rear wheel. You know, I made those recommendations in the build video, the previous build video that I did kind of toward the end. And that alone has generated a lot of feedback and questions, obviously, mainly because there was one very popular class of truck that I mentioned is an absolute waste, in my opinion. So I'll be discussing that more in length in next week's part 2 video. But of course, in the meantime, I'd love to hear what you think below about the Q&As that I shared in today's video, so definitely drop me a comment below. You know, the whole point of doing these videos, or at least my goal, is to put helpful information out there for folks that are shopping for a truck, because they are so expensive. It's a huge major purchase, and it's your hard-earned money. You don't want to waste it. And so really you want to know as much as possible about the truck and what options you should order. So anyway, I hope these videos are helpful. As always, thanks for watching.